body for sports psychology. Oh, that's always good. Yeah. Um, I'm a sports psychology expert, and I will soon be a certified mental performance coach, which is the governing body here in the US. I also work for an organization called Compete Sports Diversity as a sports diversity leader. Currently, I'm a lecturer at Gonzaga University here in Spokane, Washington. I'm also a sports psychologist with the Pride Cheerleading Association, which is a very large organization of cheerleaders that utilizes its LGBT cheerleaders that utilize cheerleading to raise money for charity, which is really cool. And a lot of my work that I've done and a lot of the work that I continue to do now is with them. I'm also an officer of membership for the Federation of Gay Games. And as far as like my history goes, it's a very, very broad and comprehensive history. But long story short, I've been working in LGBT sport since 2008. I think I can officially actually share this presentation. I've been working in sport since 2008 in various roles. So I worked with conglomerate of organizations, right? So LGBT sports teams and organizations and governing bodies like Federation of Gay Games and Pride Cheerleading Associations and all these different groups. I've been to 4 gay games now, and the fifth one is coming up this summer in Valencia. I'm also the first, as far as I know, the first openly gay male coach to coach in the German Regionalliga and the Bezirksliga, which are you've got the Bundesliga, which is the first and second team. So if you ever hear of like Borussia Dortmund or FC Bayern Munich, those are the Bundesliga teams, and then the Regionalliga is the teams below them, right? So the equivalent of like minor league soccer teams in Germany as well. So I studied for 6 years in Germany, where I got my PhD and master's. Here's a picture of me at the Gay Games in Guadalajara. I'm actually in this photo conducting a
We
short
can't see your
intervention.
photos.
Sorry, go ahead.
We can't see your photos.
Oh, hold on. I'm yeah, navigating the new computer as well. So oh yeah, that's right. I guess you can't see that. So let me switch that over for you real quick. Yeah, as I mentioned, I just got like a brand new computer yesterday, so I still need to make sure everything is working in order. See all of my guinea
That's
pig.
better.
Are you going to see
Yeah.
that? Oh,
Yeah.
fabulous.
Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, so this is a picture of me at the Gay Games Guadalajara. I'm actually conducting a short intervention similar to what you just did right now for mindfulness and presence at the Gay Games in Guadalajara for the cheerleaders, actually, who are all in the audience behind me at this point. So, and that was actually rooted in this case study that I just had published last summer regarding my experiences in working with this specific cheerleading group, specifically at the Gay Games in Guadalajara, based on a catastrophic injury that occurred with one of the athletes there. And it was quite an interesting experience, both being there for that event as well, navigating it, but also publishing it too. And it was interesting for me, and the reason why I wanted to highlight this is not just because of the case study itself, but this is actually the first study to reference gay games in the entirety of sports psychology research literature, and is also one of the very first in sports psychology literature to also examine the topic of psychological first aid. And
Wow.
so it was a pretty significant study on that front. On that end, I emailed Chloe a copy of the PDF that she can distribute to you. So if you're interested in learning more about that work, definitely check out that paper as well. And so, as you saw, I want to play a little game with y'all to kind of get things going and also to kind of make you a little uncomfortable. So when I was growing up, I grew up in the early 2000s and TV was just really wild. And there was a very offensive, transphobic um, game that they used to play on the talk show Maury called Can You Guess, Man or Woman? And they would bring out various drag queens, transgender women, and cisgender women to come out, and the audience had to play, is this a man or a woman, right? And I've always actually played this game very well with the work that we do in this exact topic and lecturer. So I want to play that with you. So if you get go to grab your phones if you have them, or you can use a computer, menti.com, use this code, or you could scan the QR code as well. I'm going to switch over the screen really quick so that we can actually um, get to that as well, which will be, give me 1 second. I got to work on my transitions is what I got to do here, but it's going to be fabulous. So make sure that screen gets switched over to Google Mentimeter. Okay, so yep. Yeah, you could same QR code here, menti.com, or the code itself. I'm gonna give you all a few seconds. quickly close my door there as well, just because there's a lot of noise coming in from outside. It's a very beautiful day outside, so I'm looking forward to spending time after this. Okay, so what this is going to do is challenge your perceptions, assumptions, and biases about about gender and sport, basically, right? So here we go. Now, first thing I want you to do is talk about some common stereotypes that you find about LGBTQI people in sports. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex people in sport. Just one or two words. What are some common stereotypes that you always come across? So start putting them in, and we'll see what pops up. Hmm. Should be. Oh, there we go. I was like, I'm making sure it's working. All right, best dressed, definitely best dressed, right? Trans women are stronger. That's a very common one, right? Very common. Predatory. Yeah, well, I've definitely experienced that myself. Imposter for sure. Cheating, soft, fragile, don't belong. Yeah, very common ones as well. Yeah. It's always interesting about stereotypes, especially because you think about stereotypes as just perceptions of people, maybe based in reality, maybe not, maybe a little bit of both, right? But they tend to, be very um they tend to be very harsh in a lot of ways, right? And there's a lot of hypocrisy, especially when it comes to stereotypes as well, and different ways that people perceive them and create them as well, right? And unfortunately, we found that stereotypes, especially marginalized communities, so not just the LGBT community, but ethnic minorities and people based on religion and race and national origin, all these other things, they're subject to these kind of stereotypes, right? Which are very harmful and it's just a negative judgment that just is hurtful for anybody in any kind of situation, right? So yeah, you got some great ones here for sure for LGBT people, especially, right? So and a lot of these is a openly gay coach and athlete myself. I'm a cisgender, openly gay male. I've experienced a lot of these myself, right? So I've been fired from sports teams for being gay, for exactly some of these things, right? So just assumptions and biases and prejudices that aren't actually true and don't reflect me as a person, but unfortunately are rooted in these kind of stereotypes. So definitely thank you for sharing some of these, right? Because that's all, kind of the reality that a lot of LGBTQ people face. And especially if you follow the news, especially trans people and especially intersex people on this front. So now, here's the thing. According to Texas state law, athletes are allowed to compete in the gender division as listed on their birth certificates. Okay. With that said, I'm going to present a few athletes. The first one being Mac Beggs. According to Texas state law, you get to poll is would Mac Beggs or the relevant athlete required to compete in the boys or the girls division or the men's or the women's division, right? So according to Texas state law, an athlete is required to compete in the gender division as listed on their birth certificate. Thus, let's talk about Meg Beggs. Should Mac Beggs compete in the male division or the female division in their sport? Has yeah, I mean Mac Beggs is definitely an interesting case study here for sure, right? So it's okay if not everybody has answered yet. Mac Beggs, as you could probably tell with the uniform and the headgear, is a wrestler. Now, this is where this whole thing came inspired by because Mac Beggs is a trans male. Thus, according to Texas state law, he has to compete in the girls' division or the women's division in high school sports, which he did. He actually underwent a physiological transition in his junior year, and as you could tell, is socially presenting himself as male, and when underwent a physiological transition. Unfortunately, he was required to compete in the girls' division, and so this created a lot of controversy, right? Because all people thought was, oh, transgender person is competing in the girls' sports, and everybody was assuming, oh, this man is dominating women's sports, right? Without understanding that, oh, according to Texas state law, Mac Beggs was required to compete in the girls' division. He ended up winning two state championships in Texas for the high school wrestling in the women's division as a result. He went on to college, where at the time the NCAA was a little bit more open about their transgender policies, and he was able to compete in the men's division in college. And then he graduated college and now is off living his life. Next one, Fallon Fox. Do you know who Fallon Fox is? Should they compete in the men's division or the women's division, male or female? Or if you don't know, you don't know. That's okay too. And for the record, Fallon Fox's sport is what is it? Mixed martial arts. Interesting poll here because Fallon Fox would actually be required to compete in the male division. Fallon Fox is the first MMA transgender woman to be at the professional level. She competed in four professional bouts in her career, three of which she won, one of which she lost. Ironically, the one that she lost, her opponent has been very outspoken against her specifically in competing as a trans woman in the women's division as well. So definitely some interesting backstory there. This is Arian Pasha. As you could tell, the sport is bodybuilding. Should they compete in the male or the female division? Okay, okay, interesting. Arian would actually be competing in the female division, interestingly enough, even looking exactly like this. He is a trans male. Pat Manuel, male or female division. All right, so yep, female division, definitely. It's kind of hard to tell, but you can see his top surgery scar right there, right? It's healed a lot since he did the transition, but he is the first trans man to be a professional boxer and is big on that sport as well. This is Nong Toom, Nong Toom. Muay Thai, I believe, is their sport, male or female. Yeah, I think y'all are starting to kind of figure out the game a little bit here. So yeah, Nong Toon would be required to compete in the men's division. So she has already undergone gender affirming surgery, as you can tell with her chest, but would definitely be required to compete in the men's division regardless. Last one, Jaya Salua. Jaya Salua. Yep, yep, y'all are right. She would be required to compete in the men's division. Now, Jaya is a very interesting case study here, okay? Because Jaya is a trans woman who actually does compete in men's soccer. So she is the very first transgender person to compete in a FIFA qualifying soccer game. She competes for American Samoa, and yeah, so she has undergone hormone therapy and gender affirming gender affirming surgery as well. But she continues to compete in men's soccer, representing American Samoa on the national team. Um, she's a very interesting case study as well because in American Samoa, she's what's considered Fa'afafine, which is a third gender category in American Samoa. It's a very accepted and appreciated part of their culture as well. And of course, it also represents kind of the conflict there between like a cultural understanding of gender versus some Western notions of gender in regard to policy and sport, right? Jaya is interesting. If you There's a movie out there, there's actually a documentary that then became a movie based on not just her story, but the story of American Samoa. It's called Next Goal Wins. I'll put that in the chat as well. Next Goal Wins. Um, Great movie that talks about not just the story of Jaya, but the story of American Samoa as a soccer team and kind of a whole context behind them competing at the FIFA qualifying tournament, where she is obviously a major character as well. But she is a very fabulous person. So we'll save this for later. Keep this open because at the end of the presentation, I wanna get some feedback from y'all. So you don't have to put anything right now since obviously we're in the middle of it. But let me go ahead and switch back over to my PowerPoint and we'll get our fabulousness going. But generally speaking, I mean, I know that was a little bit kind of, what not really sure what we are getting at here, right? Last question for you all, and feel free to open up the microphone for the classroom or your own as well. But this is a very interesting picture because if you notice in the entire previous slides, yep. All right, can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, making sure everything turns out. So if you notice, with the exception of Jaya, all of those athletes are individual sport athletes, right? So you had a various combat sports, um, as well as I think mostly as combat sports as well, right? But there was an interesting case last year with the San Jose State women's volleyball team, where several teams actually were boycotting and forfeiting the games against San Jose State because they had a transgender woman competing for the team. So this is a picture of the San Jose State women's volleyball team from the 2024-2025 season. Now, you don't have to answer specifically because, well, there's really no answer at all. But just look at this picture and try to figure out who is the transgender woman in this team. And it's a very hard question to answer because thankfully, despite all the controversy and all the drama that was created as a result, the San Jose State volleyball team was very good about protecting the identity of the trans woman on the team, right? So as we've seen in news, with especially these individual sport athletes, I think Leah Thomas, the swimmer, will come to mind. Especially there's like a lot of hatred, a lot of vitriol talk, and a lot of just very prejudicial, very discriminatory things. So when this controversy was occurring, they were very key about protecting the identity of the trans woman. So honestly, I've got no idea who is the trans woman on this team, right? And it's okay because we don't have to know. It's not really any of our business. But unfortunately, it's part of the kind of controversy and drama that gets created whenever we have these kind of discussions. But I want to talk about some important terms, right? So we talk about gender binary, a strict categorical definition of gender, male or female, right? Very common within our society. We also have what we call gender assigned at birth, also known as biological sex, right? Which is your anatomical gender as documented, usually on your birth certificate at birth. Most typically, this is based on the appearance of external genitalia, right? So you get born as a baby, doctor looks at your genitalia and decides, okay, that's a vagina, that's a penis. Put that check on the birth certificate, and there you go. Gender identity. This is represents the social construct of gender for which it represents a person's sense of self, right? Which in the case of a cisgender person aligns with their gender assigned at birth, right? So your external genitalia aligns with your sense of identity as an individual, right? Men, woman, masculine, feminine, things like that. Transgender is where the gender identity does not align with gender assigned at birth, right? And when this happens, that's what we call the transgender because they transition to a gender that aligns with your identity, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. For people who are non-binary, is that their gender identity does not align with the strict gender binary, right? So men, male or female, it could be maybe a little bit of both, maybe neither, however the person feels that they identify for themselves, right? And then you have intersex, which is also known as differential sex development, is where their gender assigned at birth does not align with the gender binary, right? So the genitalia is not necessarily male or female. It could be both. It could be neither. It could be all sorts of things that can happen there. And we'll talk about that here in a second. To give you a little bit of history about sport and gender identity, really finds its roots in what's called the Women's World Games. So from 1896 to about 1936, the Olympics were actively excluding women from participating because they felt that sports was too masculine, that competition was too aggressive, it was unladylike, it was unbecoming of women, and they felt that it was bad for reproductive health. I mean, some of the doctors that claiming what that was going to happen if a woman dared to run a marathon is hilarious. Like, especially when you think about like nowadays, you look now like, really, did they think that? But it was a thing, right? So, of course, as a result, though, and we know that with the suffragette movement, women's liberation, all these things like that, you could only exclude people from something for so long before they decide, okay, you know what, we want to do this, so we're going to make our own spaces for it. As a result, the Women's World Games at the time, also known as the Women's Olympics, was created by this woman, Alice Milliet. And basically, it was a women's Olympics, right? So an entire multi-sport athletic event centered around women's participation, right? So it was held in 1922 in Paris. They had one in 1926, 1930, and 1934 as well. And it was notable because this was the first sporting event in which women were allowed to compete in track and field. And this is the key because track and field were events that women were actively excluded from, not just by the International Olympic Committee, but what we now call World Athletics, which at the time was the International Athletics Associations of Federated. It was I don't know, but now it's World Athletics, which is much easier to remember, right? But they actively excluded women from participating in any track and field events. But the Women's World Games started to challenge that, right? So what happened was, well, it turns out when women have the opportunity to do things like compete in sport on an equal and fair level, well, they like to compete in sport. And that's exactly what happened. So the Women's World Games started to grow and started to become popular to the point where, of course, as we know with patriarchal institutions, it became a threat. And the IOC and the World Athletics consider the Women's World Games as a threat to the entire institution of the Olympics and of what the World Athletics was trying to represent at the time. So they were able to negotiate with Alice Milliet regarding the inclusion of track and field in the 1928 Olympics, which was the first time women were allowed to compete in track and field, including the 800 meter, which was interesting because it was contested for the first time. But it's funny too, if you actually go watch the video of the 800 meter at the women's at the 1920 Olympics, at the end of the race, as you can imagine, running an 800 meter and Olympic competition, people are going to be pretty, out of breath at the end, right? So they're huffing and puffing. It was a very close race too. So, I mean, they were really running and stuff like that. Of course, the side of women huffing and puffing and, bending over, trying to catch their breath, things like that, right? Well, it turns out to the men at the time, they thought it was unbecoming. They thought it was unsightly. They did not like the look of that, right? So as a result, they banned women from racing in 800 meter or above for the next 30 years, right? So the next time that women were allowed to compete in the 800 meter was like the 1968 Olympics in, I think it was Mexico City, but it was sometime in the 1960s exactly, right? So kind of sees like how that, they don't like women when the women compete at a strong level, to say the least, right? Now, what's interesting too, especially with the transgender athlete debate, is that it started with the Women's World Games. And at the time, there were several non-feminine cis women who took part of the World Games, right? Because we know, okay, you could be a woman, but there's masculine women, there's feminine women, right? So it's okay to be a woman and be masculine, or be like a man and be feminine, right? So and you see the stereotype often in women's sports, right? A lot of masculine women in women's sports, which is why the stereotype that a lot of women in sports are lesbian, because it's a stereotype based on just masculine representation of women in sports. So what happened at the Women's World Games was there was a lot of athletes from Eastern European countries. Now, Eastern Europe at the time was very agricultural. They had a lot of very laborious, just general lifestyle, physical activity, things like that, right? So you're talking about like big, muscular, strong women that were competing. Well, of course, in Western countries like Canada, the US, things like that, where women were more, restricted to the household, restricted to basic duties, maybe still a remnant of the Victorian era, things like that, where you got smaller, more dainty, feminine women from these Western company countries going up against these big, strong, athletic women from Eastern Europe. Generally speaking, of course, the Western countries' women started to complain because they felt they had an unfair advantage, that they had to compete against these larger, more athletic women, um, and just created all this drama on their front. And then at the same time, around that time, several prominent women track and field athletes who competed at the Women's World Games later came out as transgender, right? So they competed, they won, but then later on they came out as transgender. So we saw some of the first real like public representation of transgender people in society at the time. They were women who transitioned to male, right? These two specifically, Zidanek, I don't know exactly how to pronounce the name, and Mark Weston. So they became global celebrities, right? Because at the time it was very novel and people didn't really know what it was. And they had already retired from women's sport at the time, but it was also at the time when a lot of these women were complaining about these, Eastern European masculine and athletic women. So it was able to easily think, oh, that's where that stereotype came from, was to say, oh, well, these men are pretending to be women in order to compete for medals and competition and things like that, right? So this is where it kind of came about, was and instigated that first major panic about transgender and intersex athletes, which of course the IOC and the World Athletics used to hop on and undermine the Women's World Games. So they're able to kind of use that to usurp control of women's sports, undermine the Women's World Games. And at the time, what they did was they questioned if those women were actually women, right? Publicly discussing the issue and saying, well, maybe there needs to be some gender verification testing, things like that, right? So it created a lot of like that initial anti-trans, anti-intersex hysteria that now 100 years later we're still dealing with, right? And it led to the formal establishment of gender verification testing in sport starting at the 1952 Olympics, right? To give you a little bit of background on that, so we've been testing women for like to consider what gender was based on the perceived fear that male athletes would pretend to be women for the sake of winning a sport competition, despite the fact that this has never actually happened, right? Those were trans men, women who later transitioned to a man after their athletic careers were over, right? There's never been the case of a man pretending to be a woman intentionally for the sake of winning a sports competition, right? But of course, that didn't stop gender verification testing from happening. So in the 1950s and 60s, it was basically, women were forced to undergo nude parades, right? So the female athletes had to line up, drop their pants, and have a doctor come along and take a look at their genitalia to see uh, decide if they were women or not, right? Which, as you can imagine, was banned for obvious reasons. So in the 60s, up until about 1999, they did chromosome testing, right? So XY for male, XX for female. But this was also banned because it turns out a lot of cisgender women discover they have XY chromosomes, right? Because this did not consider XXY chromosomes or a single chromosome or things like that, right? So a lot of women who live their entire lives who are cisgender were banned from sport competition as well. It just was not a valid or reliable measure, especially in fitting in with the binary gender category. So in the 2000s and 2010, they really didn't know what to do at the time. So they figured we'll take it on a case by case basis. But what they did was they started to use serum testosterone levels. So they would require some of these specific cases, which we might get into here in a second, to say, well, your serum testosterone has to be under a certain amount, right? 10 nanomoles of liter per liter of blood or something like that. And it was required that if your testosterone was above that, you had to take drugs or do surgery or something like that in order to get it under that amount, right? So forcing women to take drugs that alter their body, right? And then as of like 2 weeks ago, they changed it from that. Now they're requiring the identification of the SRY gene, right? Which is basically just an evolution of chromosome testing, right? Because the SRY gene is found only in the Y chromosome, and that's where it's usually detected. But then you have the same issue as the chromosome testing. itself, right? And this is where you hit with differential sex disorders, so intersex athletes, right? Where a group of conditions in which there is a discrepancy between the external genitals and the internal genitals, right? So not everything develops correctly, not everything exists, or maybe, there's all sorts of things that can happen, right? Um, Sex chromosomes are inconsistent with genitalia and sex hormone production, right? So genitals may not look the same as other cisgender people, or may not properly develop in the womb, or maybe after the womb during puberty. They may not function properly. Who knows? I mean, there's, a huge diversity of conditions in this case, right? And as far as the SRY gene goes, it provides instructions for making a protein called the sex determining region Y protein, right? So this is the gene and protein that is responsible for the development of male genitalia. So even if you have the SRY gene, it may not be activated, in which, if that's the case, then you don't develop your male genitalia, right? So mutations and dysregulation in this gene can lead to XX chromosomes and male genitalia, or XY chromosomes and what they call gonadal dysgenesis, in which is the abnormal development of genitalia. And here's some common athletes. So you got Stella Walsh, Mark Weston, Duty Chon, and Caster Semenya. She's kind of the big poster child of this whole thing. I mean, read her book. It is intense of this, some of the crazy shit they put her through on that front. But we'll talk about transgender athletes, right? So what is transgender? It's a state where one's gender identity does not align with their gender assigned at birth. This is actually in the DSM-5. It's classified as gender dysphoria, in which the prescribed treatment is gender transition, right? So what is transition? You got the social transition, which is that social outward appearance, right? So you dress in the clothes, or you have your hair styled, you use makeup, you change your name, you change your legal documentation, things like that, right? So socially presenting yourself as the gender that you identify with, right? Then you have the physiological transition, right? So gender affirming hormone therapy. Either you're taking hormone suppressors, so testosterone suppressors or estrogen suppressors, and or hormone supplements, right? So a lot of trans men, you'll often hear them say, "Oh, I'm on the T," right? So they're taking testosterone, or they're taking estrogen or something like that, right? So it's important to consider, especially on this front. It's very unique to the individual as well, right? So there's no real like, oh, you do this, and this exact. Everybody has their own unique approach to it, right? And then you also have the surgical, the gender affirming surgery, right? So you have top surgery, which is either you remove breasts or you add breasts. And then you have the bottom surgery, right? Which is either you add a penis or you take away a penis and add a vagina, right? Um, and again, every trans person, they may go through all these things, they may not. It's really depends on the individual and what comes down to what their identity is, right? So it's really a very subjective process. So you have trans men, which are assigned female at birth, transitioning to a male. So this is my friend Chris Mosier here, the first trans person to be on Team USA when he qualified for duathlon a bunch of years back. You also have trans women who are assigned a male at birth and transition to female. So you have Renee Richards here, who is the first trans woman to compete in professional sports. So she challenged tennis in 1977 and was able to compete as a woman in professional tennis. So you think about the discussions around transgender athletes, right? So the discussion always centers around trans women. And it is assumed because it's assumed that trans men do not have an unfair advantage. And so a lot of times trans men are often excluded from the debate entirely, right? They just forget trans men exist. It always centers around trans women who win, despite the fact that there's many trans women who compete that don't win, right? But it's only the ones who win that everybody tends to focus on. There's a lot of major policies, as you can imagine, governing trans women, right? So the entire thing with the IOC right now and all the politics and things about the current administration, it's all about trans women, has nothing to do with trans men. They're not even part of the discussion, like I said. As far as scientific research, it's limited, right? So it is a reasonable question to say, do trans athletes have an advantage? But it's limited, right? Because science takes time and is relatively new as far as our ability to actually pursue this from a scientific approach. But also the fact that there's a lack of participants available. If you're banning trans women from competing in sport, then you don't have any trans women to draw from as a sample for actually doing this research, right? And so by restricting these athletes, well, how can we do the research if we can't have an athlete pool to draw from to do the research with, right? But the current research that is available, and there's a bit, there is no definitive evidence to support the claim that trans athletes retain an performance advantage, right? So the research that does exist just doesn't confirm the hypothesis that trans athletes have an advantage. Now, there are effects of male puberty that are retained following a physiological and surgical transition, but these effects are increasingly diminished over time. And again, it's like there's no evidence to show, oh, it's because of this, right? Because athletics and sport and performance is very subjective to a lot of factors, but not one study has been able to show, oh, it's because you're having an advantage because of gender transition, right? So it's not without a reasonable doubt, to say the least. Gender affirming hormone therapy does lead to physiological changes in the body and physical changes in the body, right? So if you take an estrogen, you're going to be retaining more body fat. You're going to have a more pear-shaped body, things like that, right? You're going to lose upper body strength. You're going to have more lower body strength. Vice versa, right? If you're taking testosterone, then you're going to build more muscles. You're going to have broader shoulders, things like that. Now, if you take the suppressors, same thing. It's going to have those changes in the body, right? Because if you don't use it, you lose it, right? So, and it's interesting too, because I've had a lot of debates with armchair scientists regarding the effects of transition, and a lot of the arguments have nothing to do with sport performance itself, right? So I had one person actually claim, oh, well, they have a higher bone density. Trans women have a higher bone density. It's like, okay, but that doesn't actually change anything about sport performance. Sport performance is not correlated with bone density, so it had nothing to do with what they were trying to actually argue here, right? Which is kind of the point of this whole thing is that if you don't know the base foundation of the topic you're debating about, then your argument is irrelevant, right? So Hamilton, Blair Hamilton, I love her to death. I got to meet her a couple years ago. She is one of the leading researchers. She's trans woman herself, leading researchers on this research. She's actually taking trans athletes, men and women, cisgender men and women, taking them all together and putting them through these typical measures of performance, right? So laboratory measures of strength, power, VO2 max, and other things to compare trans men and women uh, athletes versus their cisgender counterparts. And so she conducted the first laboratory study on that front. Um, so there were some limitations to her research, one of which was the fact that she had a limited participant pool, right? Because like I said, if you're banning athletes from participating, well, it's kind of hard to find athletes then to draw from as far as research goes, right? They had athletes representing various levels of sport and athletic experience, right? So some were generally like novice, some were more experienced, things like that. And it was a short-term study, right? So they only did the measures once. They just brought them in, took the measures, and then compared that as well, right? So there were some limitations to the study, but what they found was that trans women athletes demonstrated actually a lower performance compared to cisgender women on metrics of forced expiratory volume in 1 second, right? So when it measures of VO2 max, cardiovascular endurance, things like that, trans women actually were at a disadvantage compared to cisgender women. They found that trans women demonstrated higher absolute grip strength, right? So absolute, which is, okay, you're just what the grip meter says compared to cisgender women, but they found no difference in relative fat-free mass or hand size, right? So when you compare absolute, which is what the actual like scale says, versus relative, which is that translated to a percent, right? So they found no difference relative to fat-free mass or hand size. So the conclusion they found was while longitudinal transitional studies of longitudinal transitioning studies of transgender athletes are urgently needed. Again, you need to do this over a series of years, not just one time. These short-term results should caution against precautionary bans of sport and eligibility exclusions that are not based on sport-specific or relevant research, right? And this is the key, right? Because if you're comparing, a marathon runner versus a weightlifter, obviously there's going to be major differences in performance, right? Because they're completely different sports. So it has to be more sport-specific. But right now, we don't have enough people, frankly, to do that level of research yet. So hopefully, as this conversation continues to go, we'll be able to build on that as well. So that's all I got for you on that front. I think we have a few minutes left. We can have some Q&A, things like that as well. But I would love to hear your thoughts, perspectives, questions. Give me what you got.
First, massive round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was awesome and super informative. I wonder if y'all have any questions. I'm gonna start just to get the ball rolling. I think about the fact that we're in Los Angeles gearing up for LA 28 here, and I would love to know if they put Dr. Smith on the board of the IOC. What are you saying off the top of your head about trans athletes in sport? Like, what's your position? What are you gonna say to them right away?
I mean, my personal position would be like, yeah, we need to make sure that they have the opportunities to compete because trans women have been able to compete at the Olympics since 2003. Let me ask you this, of not just trans women, trans athletes altogether, I will say, altogether since 2003. Since 2003, how many trans athletes overall have competed at the Olympics? Two. One trans man, one trans woman, both at the Tokyo Olympics in 2021, 2020 or whatever like that. So now I can see the view of the classroom. Quick, just pull of hands here. One of those athletes won a gold medal, became the first trans person to win a gold medal in the Olympics. Who do you think it was, the trans man or the trans woman? Raise your hand if you think it was the trans woman. You are all correct because it was the trans man. You know?
What sport was it for?
Soccer. And
Cool.
here's kind of the fun complications with trans men as well. So it's Quinn is the name of the soccer player. They compete for the Canadian women's national team, but they identify currently as non-binary, but they also use he, him pronouns. He has undergone top surgery, but he has delayed the physiological transition. He has delayed hormone therapy specifically because even though it's gender affirming hormone therapy, testosterone is still regulated by the World Anti-Doping Association. And thus, he was unable to be eligible to compete while on testosterone, regardless of what gender division he would be in, right? But the rules also say for trans men is that he is allowed to compete in the women's division so long as he has not started or ever taken testosterone. So he's delayed that aspect of his transition so he can continue competing on the women's team because he can, in theory, qualify for the men's division on testosterone, but he would have to qualify for therapeutic use exemption at the World Anti-Doping Association, which takes like years and years and years to get. And if you get it all, and by then, usually athletic careers are over because the athletic careers, it's like you're over by that, right? So he's like, I'm just going to wait until after I retire and then I'll start the hormone therapy.
Yeah, that's awesome. You have your questions or anyone online?
Yeah, feel free to leave a question in the chat as well if you're online.
Off of your answer for the last one, is that I feel like there might be like some possibly some like mental repercussions for that because you're delaying your treatment or not necessarily treatment, you're delaying the therapy that might that helps you feel more gender affirmed.
Yeah.
So that
And
could
that's
be
Yeah,
yeah.
and you're exactly right. There's a lot of mental health concerns, right? I mean, we know that trans people just in general actually are an increase. They're the highest the minority population at the highest risk of mental health development disorders and suicide as well, which is a big aspect of it. And you can imagine not just the delay of the transition, but just even existing, even trying to do sport. I don't know if you're familiar with Leah Thomas. She's the swimmer who competed at the NCAA championships a few years ago. I mean, how do you walk into a place where literally everybody there is protesting you, and you walk in and they're shouting death threats and telling how much they hate you, and then everybody like you go up onto the block and everybody's booing you, and then your competitors are looking at you like they just want to beat you up. And I mean, how can a person deal with that, just mentally speaking, and still remain mentally healthy and sound? It's a challenge for sure. And yeah, when you have to delay parts of your transition like that, it's not easy to say the least.
What would you say for us as aspiring psychologists in this field? Like, how can we best support the trans community in general, but maybe even trans athletes more specifically?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite quotes is from Ted Lasso, right? Even though it's technically not Ted Lasso, it's actually from what he quoted. I don't remember the original author, but be curious, not judgmental, right? Do you remember the dart scene? Be curious, not judgmental. Be curious. It's okay. You don't have to know everything, right? It's okay. Ask questions, but do it from a sense of genuine curiosity, right? And just be supportive on that front and understand it's like because like you said, people make assumptions, people make judgments, people do all these things, and you don't have to know everything, but just it's okay to just ask questions and be friendly and supportive and things like that, right? Because ironically, I actually had a student last week was we were talking about my case study and we were talking about exactly this, and he was like, how many sports psychologists do you know that specialize in trans athletes? And I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'm the only one because I don't know. There's A, not a whole lot of trans athletes to work with, and B, you know, not many people are even aware of these things, right? But like this foundational knowledge, right? So just understanding, okay, pronouns and what does that mean for identity, right? Because in the end, it's identity, right? And you'll probably talk a lot about like self-determination theory, which is big, right? Self-determination theory, and they talk about the psychosocial needs that need to be satisfied that help influence motivation, right? It's autonomy, competency, and social support. So for you, especially a psychologist, it's making sure you just provide social support, autonomy, right? That's the biggest thing about identity. If I come up and I say, okay, you identify as she, her pronouns, but I come up and I call you a him, right? You're probably going to be like, that's not me, right? But in trans people all the time will say, well, that you are a man because you're blah blah, and they'll challenge a person's identity on that front, right? So it's just respecting a person's identity, give them the autonomy to let them be themselves, and things like that, right? So I think that's really just what it comes down to, is just making sure that you, like I said, have a growth mindset, just respect them, basic levels of respect, just be a nice human, basically. Any other questions?
I just wanted to add, if I could jump in. First of all, thank you so much. Great presentation. And I do similar kinds of trainings with teachers in schools because they're well-meaning and don't have background knowledge. So I'm so grateful for your information as well, because I can take little tidbits and give it to them as well. And I think thinking about the restrictions on the trans women and what you said about, like, no one's thinking about the trans man, right? I have a trans son. Nobody cares about him in that way, right? He's in trouble in other ways, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But it's interesting to me that there is no discussion of the huge variety in physiology among cisgender athletes that do give them advantages. They just like, nobody complains like, you're too tall to play basketball. That's unfair, right? People are not saying that, nobody's complaining that Michael Phelps has an inordinately large wingspan, but everybody just goes, oh, wow, like he's so fast because he has these, by the way, genetic advantages, but nobody's complaining about them. And so the disconnect or the hypocrisy, whatever you want to call it, is really startling. And like you mentioned several times in your presentation, really comes back to the policing of what's female, what's feminine, the control over the female body, the female presentation, what we can and can't do. And so the misogyny is just layered in and very, very real. Dr. Smith, I'm sure you know about this resource. I'm going to throw it out for other individuals. The book by Skylar Baylor called He, She, They is unbelievable. And he is also a trans athlete, and his story is very powerful. It's in the book. Thank you for putting it in the chat. And has that personal experience. He was very good friends with Leah, the swimmer that you mentioned, and just fascinating journey and really interesting, I think, especially people who are studying psychology, to really get inside the mind of this trans athlete. And he's an advocate and a speaker, and it was very, very powerful for me. So thanks.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up because it's all rooted in sexism and misogyny. It's all
That's
about
right.
control of women's bodies and policing gender and all this bullshit like that, right? I mean, because that's why I wanted to highlight, because I mean, not only does Michael Phelps have a long wingspan, but he also has a specific condition that allows him to produce less lactate in his muscles than the average athlete, so he doesn't fatigue nearly as quickly. But you also think about like not just the race, the sexism behind it, but also the racism.
Yep, 100%.
Because you can look at, say, Katie Ledecky, right? She owns the top 50 fastest times in her event.
Yep.
And she's a cisgender white woman. And everybody's like, yeah, Katie Ledecky. I'm like, she's the one dominating women's sports, right?
That's right.
But you look at like Brittany Griner, Serena Williams, and these other athletes of color, that, maybe are more masculine or maybe have muscles or things like that, right? Suddenly, oh, that's a man. That's a
They're
man,
suspect.
and they're suspect and they're, oh,
Yeah.
that's unrealistic and, all these other things like that as well. So you have to also recognize that it's both misogyny and sexism, but also racism and
Yep.
then you get all this craziness in there as well. I mean, there's no
Yep.
shortage of the way that people will find ways to discriminate against somebody else. It's quite terrifying, actually.
Yes.
Yeah, but any other questions? Any thoughts?
I had one. Sorry, I don't know if you can see me. I'll come into view.
Yeah, I was gonna say I see three. There you are. I see you. Hey.
I wasn't able to see a lot of the presentation because I had another meeting, but thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to learn from you. I have a lot of kids at my treatment center. It's a PhD IOP, mental health. And a lot of my kids identify as non-binary or trans. And it's challenging because they're little ones, so they're 7 to 12, and I want to be respectful of them and their chosen pronouns. But a lot of the time I notice that the parents either don't know that they're using different pronouns or are uncomfortable or discouraging or like, oh yeah, they're going through a phase. Like you could just call them by these pronouns. And of course, we're doing official documentation and I'm doing assessments with them. And so I'm writing these assessment reports. And something that I keep coming across is which pronouns do I use in these reports? Because I want to be validating of the child's identity. And at the same time, I don't want to put them in a position where they have to like have this conversation with their parents if they're not ready to come out to their parents. And so, or there's, a discordance between what the parents believe and what the child feels is true for them. So I was just wondering what recommendations you have along that line. And of course, it's not directly related to sports, but a lot of our kids want to do sports and it's helpful for them. And it does relate what kind of team that they play on and what they desire versus what their parents desire.
Yeah. And I mean, the great thing about sport, and I love sports so much because there's the social, physical, and mental benefits of sport. It offers so much, especially when done well, especially to people like non-binary and trans people and things like that. One, I would recommend remind the parents that kids at that age, they're trying to figure out who they are. Right. In your mind, you're okay. I don't like that's why, you think about when you're like a kid, you're wearing weird clothes and you go through I'm in my goth phase or whatever like that. Right. I mean, you look back at pictures and you're like, ooh, don't want to, because we're all just trying to figure out who we are.
Yeah.
Right. And we don't have it clear yet. So the great thing is that the social transition on that front, it's very inconsequential, right? All you're doing is maybe a haircut or clothes or things like that. And of course, maybe there's the social side where if you go to school one day wearing a dress, but everybody knows you as a male, and all of a sudden you wear a dress. Of course, you have to deal with the social consequences, right? But remind the parents it's like, well, they're kids and they just want to try and figure out who they are. Give them the room to explore identities. So if they want to use they, them, or she, her, or he, him pronouns, just roll with it, right? Maybe it is a phase, maybe it's not a phase. Well, but it doesn't hurt to try. And then at the same time, like when you work with the kids, just ask them like, hey, what are your pronouns? How do you identify? And then just clarify on that front, right? Because maybe one week it is they, them, maybe next week it's he, him, or she, her, right? Because it's also just rooted in all those different types of identities on that front, right? And they're just trying to figure it out, right? See what fits, what feels right to them on that front as well. And unfortunately, with sport, it can get a little complicated because of the gender divisions. But I also like to point out that pre-puberty, there's no athletic difference between boys and girls. Like that can be attributed to gender, right? It's all based on either like just size, and growth and experience in the sport and things like that. So for youth sports, me personally, I would prefer if youth sports, generally speaking, were not gender segregated, but more segregated based on things like ability, body size, and experience and things like that, right? Because that also really does well to help bust stereotypes about like, oh, well, girls are weaker than boys. Like, put everybody together on a team and you'll discover that girl ain't weak, it's like I've got my butt kicked many times myself. I've learned that lesson the hard way. But also just like it creates a more like representation of, hey, there's, even if like, yeah, being a woman and being feminine is a great thing. Being a man, being a boy is a great thing as well, right? But you don't have to limit yourself to these toxic gender stereotypes or toxic identities, because it's just to say, hey, we can all play sport together. We can all have fun. I can get to know you as a person rather than as a label kind of thing like that, right? So I don't know if it's possible within your facility, but if possible, I mean, let the kids play together based on abilities and body sizes and things like that, right? Because like I said, pre-puberty, they don't have any particular athletic differences based on gender. And you'll even notice that in certain sports, especially the Paralympics, wheelchair basketball, wheelchair rugby specifically, are mixed gender sports. There is no gender divisions in those sports at the Paralympic level, right? So, it goes to show that yes, men and women and boys and girls can play together equally and have a good fun game together. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, that's helpful. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. We do have to head to class, so we're gonna head off this call. If you guys want to stay on, you're welcome to. And I will be forwarding the PowerPoint you sent and the article that you've written to Jason as LACPA. Thank you, LACPA, for hosting this meeting with us. We'll be sharing all the information as well. And yeah, any questions, I can have them come to me or to Jason, or we can send them to you if anything comes up. But thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Thanks, Chloe. Thanks, David.
Dude. Let me get this guy. Yeah.
Are you staying on, David? I'm gonna get going and eat in just a second, but
Yeah, I was gonna stay on for a few minutes if anybody else had any questions or things like that, but I'm also ready for lunch too.
sure. Actually, now it's us and someone named Alfredo who is on the phone right now.
I'm just
Is it-
gonna stop the recording, but feel free
Okay.
to keep chatting.
Sure. Okay. And then I guess whoever is in the room too. I guess they're sort of with us too.